Now, when you look at what the Troika imposed on Greece, they were requiring a sustained government surplus of 4.5% of GDP. And at the same time, they had the objective that the nominal rate of growth should be 3%. Now, I want to point out just how impossible that combination is. But what's going on there, they're seeing, effectively the government is being seen as a household or a business. And the argument goes that businesses should be profitable, which means their revenue in should be less than their expenditure out. And that's the same sort of idea you're imposing on the government, that same sort of vision. And if you do it long enough, you'll be profitable and the economy will boom. And I have a wonderful cartoonist producing a cartoon version of Debunking Economics, a guy called Miguel Guerra. Does a group called Seven Robots, and you've got a beautiful cartoon satire. I hope you can read the text there, probably a bit too small, but this is Merkel berating Yanis Varoufakis with the Troika singing a Greek choir in the background. And she's saying to him, you're going to take this new debt and use it to pay off your already soul-crushing, insurmountable debt. And when you haven't got a prayer of ever recovering, bam, that's when prosperity happens. Why can't you see it? Okay. I want to take a strictly monetary look at this whole idea that running a surplus is a good idea for a government. And this is sort of thought experiment that I hope you'll find it's something you could actually use with friends who still fall for the argument that a surplus is a good idea, because superficially it makes sense because people think instantly of the government as if it's like a household. And that's the reason this particular fallacy falls into people's minds so easily. So divide society into two halves, government and private. Draw a box in your mind. I'm going to show you a rectangle on the screen in a short while, but draw a rectangle in your mind and divide it in two and call one half the government, the other half the private sector. Well, the surplus means the flow of government taxes is greater than the flow of government spending. So that means that there's a net flow of money from the private sector in that box to the government sector. So you've got a flow going from private to government in your box. Call that net gov. Okay? If that's going to be positive on the government side, it's got to be precisely the same negative on the private side. Okay? This is a point that modern monetary theory has been making for a while. So if you want to have the government running a surplus, it means the private sector has to run a deficit, which means rather than the government saving, inverted commas, enabling you to save more, it actually, to them to save, they've got to be taking money out of your bank accounts. Whether they're saving or not, you certainly aren't under the influence of that. That's the first stage. So what you've got is a transfer of money going through. Now, that means, in the case of what the Troika has imposed on Greece, that the flow of money going from the private sector to the government must be equivalent to 4.5% of GDP per year. Now, where can you get the money? I'm writing a post on my Forbes column right now, which I'm calling How to Make Money. A bit of a satire because, most people think make money, the idea is invent a better mousetrap and you'll make money that way. No, you don't make money by inventing a better mousetrap. You have to make money by printing it somehow. And of course, if we try to do that, we get thrown in jail. Okay? So the government can print money, but the other group that can print money is the private banking sector. So if you have this sort of flow going on, then on a one-off basis, it's not impossible. It can be done occasionally, a one-off flow. The Troika is talking about 10 or 15 years of a surplus of that scale. But it still means the opposite of what they believe, because it means a flow of money from the private sector to the government, reducing the money in the private sector. But if you have to provide that flow indefinitely, there's only two ways to do it. Either you reduce your bank balances fall by the equivalent of 4.5% of GDP per annum, or you borrow that money from the banks. So you've now got to take that rectangle and divide half of it in two again, and make one half the banking sector and the other half the non-bank private sector. And the loans being issued by the banks to the private non-bank sector have to be, to keep the amount of money in the private sector constant, have to also be 4.5% of GDP per annum. Okay? So call that net bank. And what you've got going on, a deficit from the banking sector's point of view, meaning they're financing the private non-bank sector, and that money is being transferred to the government. Now, if you put that together, if it's just so what you borrow is exactly equivalent to what the government wants to run as a surplus, that means the private sector's level of debt is growing by 4.5% of GDP per annum. Now, that's a way of thinking at the moment which only has a constant amount of money in the economy. Okay? Because money flowing in, money flowing out, the same constant amount. You can't get 3% growth out of that situation unless the rate of turnover of money is rising by 3% per annum. Okay? Now, we know that that isn't happening because when you look at the historical data, if you had a constant money stock, the velocity is actually falling. This is a historical chart from the very good database the St. Louis Federal Reserve runs. And this is what they call money of zero maturity, which is probably the best guide to an accurate measure of the basic money stock. And that shows that the rate of turnover of money used to be twice per annum, rose to a peak of being money turning over 3.5 times per annum during the 1980s, and then has been on a downward trend ever since. It's probably heading down towards 1. So the rate of turnover of money is declining, and it actually falls during recessions. So rather than that sort of spending being compensated by an increasing velocity of money, it's likely to be made worse, okay, because the velocity of circulation is also likely to slow down. So if you have a government surplus where the surplus is completely financed by the private sector borrowing money off the banks to pay for it, at best you get no economic growth. More likely you're going to get an economic contraction if it's slowed down in velocity as well. And you're going to have a rising ratio of private debt to GDP. In that example I'm using now, the rate of growth of debt being 4.5% of GDP per annum, the rate of GDP growth at best being 0, you're getting a rising private debt burden. So the only way to get growth with a government surplus like that is for the private sector to borrow more money than it needs to pay to the government as well. So if you want to have a growing economy, while you've got the government running a surplus at the same time, then the private sector has to be borrowing money at a greater rate than the government's running a surplus, which means, yes, you can get growth out of that, but the rate of growth of debt is faster still. GDP may well grow for a while. Of course, we know most of that growth is going to be focused in asset price inflation, because that's where most of that borrowed money goes. But you're going to have a faster rate of growth of debt than GDP, faster than in the case of no growth, which I began with there. So in the medium term, if you sustained a government deficit for something like, say, 5 or 10 years, seeing the government as a causal factor here, you have a rising private debt to GDP ratio and ultimately an economic crisis. Because at some stage the private sector simply won't borrow any more money, the banks won't lend any more money, the whole thing goes into reverse. So a government surplus is a great way of causing a future economic crisis. Now, if you're lucky, it happens when your opponents have taken over government, and you can blame them for it, which is certainly what happened in Australia.